There are evenings when Oxford feels less like a city and more like a half-forgotten poem. I remember one such evening with particular clarity. A rain had set in just after 5, not the sudden downpour that drives tourists to the shelter of the covered market, but the slow, persistent kind that softens edges and fills gutters with reluctant rivers. The lamps along Magdalen Bridge flickered into a pale authority over the wet stone, and the water beneath, dark and sluggish, carried away the blurred reflections of a town unsure of its own permanence. I had stopped there, foolishly perhaps, with no umbrella and no desire to find one. My shoes had taken in more water than was wise, and I knew the whisky waiting in my cupboard would do little to cure the inevitable chill. Yet I lingered, as I always lingered, tracing the uneven sweep of the rooftops and listening to the shiver of bicycles along the High. There was a peculiar sense of suspended time, of Oxford pressing pause between daylight and darkness. I might have stayed longer if not for the small, irritating presence of the newspaper beneath my arm. Its damp edges had begun to curl against my coat, urging me to unfold it once again. I had bought it without intention, from a boy who looked too young for the trade, his hair plastered to his head, his coins rattling nervously as though they had betrayed him. The headline was nothing, some muttering about political resignations, an industrial strike. But buried deep in that narrow column where the type always seems to smudge was a line I had already read thrice. Dr. Adrian Felton, Fellow of St. Sepulchre's College, was found dead in his rooms late last night. A respected classicist, Dr. Felton had published several works of translation and was engaged in research at the time of his passing. College officials have confirmed that the death was sudden, but of natural causes. Natural causes! How swiftly those two words are pressed into service, like an exhausted porter still expected to carry another load. They satisfy most readers. They soothe the widow and the bursar alike, and yet they rarely satisfy me. Something about the phrasing had left me restless. Perhaps it was the clumsy conjunction of respectability and suddenness, or the fact that a man engaged in research is rarely eager to depart his desk mid-sentence. I thought then of Schubert, whose unfinished symphony lingered at the edge of my mind as the rain tapped a rhythm on the bridge. There are men whose lives close too abruptly, leaving cadences unresolved. Felton, a translator of elegies, had joined their company. Lewis found me later in the evening, though not on the bridge. He has a talent for locating me in pubs where I had promised myself I would not go. He mentioned the death in passing with the sort of casual authority younger men assume when the world has not yet taught them suspicion. "Heart failure," he said. "No doubt about it. Nothing for us in it." I let him speak and gave a nod, though the whisky had already steered my mood towards silence. Heart failure may be the neatest explanation of all, but it rarely explains enough. And there had been that other detail, small enough that even I nearly missed it. The misprint in the obituary, where the name of the college chapel had been rendered as St. Sepulchre instead of St. Sepulchre. A trivial matter unless one cared about precision. And Felton, I recalled dimly from an academic dinner years before, had cared very much about precision. The rain thickened as I left the pub that night. The bridge was almost deserted, save for a couple whispering under one coat, and a cyclist whose lamp flickered weakly against the gloom. I paused once more, watching the city dissolve into blurred halos, and felt that odd mixture of curiosity and melancholy that so often precedes my work. Perhaps it was only the whisky, or the rain, or the faint memory of a man's voice reciting Greek with too much pride. But I knew then, though I could not have said why, that Dr. Adrian Felton's death would not let me be. And so I crossed the bridge, wet shoes squelching in muted protest, carrying beneath my arm a newspaper whose smudged words had already become a summons. The Court of St. Sepulchre's is one of those quadrangles that seems to exhale the centuries. The stone, darkened by centuries of damp, gives back the faint smell of moss and chalk dust. Rain lingers in the grooves of flagstones, and the windows of the hall reflect nothing but their own dim light. It is a place designed, I sometimes think, to remind men that their lives are brief digressions in a long paragraph of history. Lewis and I arrived on a grey morning when the bells from nearby colleges were tolling for matins. He had driven too fast along the Banbury Road, while I had allowed my mind to drift across the columns of the previous evening's newspaper. The name Felton had begun to echo uninvited, as though it were the solution to a crossword clue I had misread. The provost received us in the lodge with little ceremony, his voice polished to the brittle courtesy of a man accustomed to irritation. He insisted, as men in his position invariably do, that there was no cause for suspicion. Felton had been a fine classicist, and it would be indecorous to suggest otherwise. Yet as he guided us across the court, I noticed his gait carried a faint impatience, as though we had interrupted some more important ritual. It was Lewis who first observed the chapel door left ajar. He nudged me toward it with a glance. Inside, the air was cold and faintly perfumed with candle grease. Along the wall, an inscription in Latin ran beneath the memorial brasses, commemorating a benefactor who had died in 1724. I read it once, then again, and felt that small unease which comes when words falter. A single letter, carved centuries ago, was wrong. Sepulchrum, misspelt as sepulchre. I thought of the newspaper misprint the evening before and felt the echo sharpen. Mistakes repeat themselves in patterns, I have always believed, and patterns are rarely innocent. We were shown to Felton's rooms by the college porter, a stooped man whose eyes gave away a habit of listening more than speaking. He remarked that Dr. Felton had returned unusually late the previous evening, muttering something about a book left in the library. The porter, who had known generations of fellows, seemed less convinced than the provost that all was in order. He spoke in a tone half-whisper, half-rebuke, as though the dead should not be too quickly tidied away. Felton's rooms bore the unmistakable marks of a scholar's life: a table scattered with dictionaries, the faint reek of tobacco, an armchair whose arms had been worn pale by restless hands. On his desk lay a sheaf of notes, lines of Greek, half translated, half abandoned. The final sentence broke off without punctuation, as though the writer had intended to return in a moment. I bent closer. The ink was darker at the last word, thicker, as though the nib had hesitated. Lewis asked the obvious questions about visitors, quarrels, and debts. The answers were vague. A bursar named Vale had lately been seen in long conversation with Felton. A younger lecturer, Redmine, had once contested a committee decision against him. Nothing dramatic, nothing violent, but I have learned that violence often arrives under the guise of scholarship and grievance. In the buttery, we were served a thin coffee in cups that rattled faintly against the saucers. A student brushed past us, murmuring apologies, and dropped a slip of paper from a notebook. It was no more than a crossword, half completed. One clue caught my eye. Elegy setting, 4 letters. The answer, no doubt, was tomb. Yet the boy had written time. I returned the slip without comment, but the mistake had already taken its place among the others. Sepulchre for sepulchre. Tomb for time. Lives translated into something slightly off, slightly wrong. When we stepped back into the court, the rain had lifted into a pale sunlight that made the stones glisten. I looked at the windows, closed now against the day, and wondered how many other secrets lay sealed behind them. Lewis asked what I thought of it all. I told him very little. only that something in this quiet college was misremembered or mistranslated, and that, in Oxford, mistranslations often conceal the truth better than lies. The Library of St. Sepulchre's had always seemed to me less a place for the living than a mausoleum for their aspirations. The air was heavy with the slow decay of vellum and ink. The desks bore the polished scars of long-forgotten elbows. It was in that silence that I found myself the following afternoon, Lewis trailing behind with his usual mixture of curiosity and mild resentment at scholarly dust. The librarian, a woman of brisk movements and clipped speech, directed us toward the register where the fellows signed out their books. She spoke, Felton's name with the practised neutrality of a custodian used to the comings and goings of men whose reputations outlasted their mortal presence. I examined the pages. Felton had borrowed 2 volumes the week before his death, one on the elegiac poets of Greece, the other a commentary on Propertius. Nothing unusual there except for the handwriting. I knew Felton's hand from a letter he had once written to the Times literary supplement, quibbling over a misquotation of Catullus. The hand in the register was similar but not identical, a softer curve to the F, a heavier stroke at the end of the N. To most eyes the difference would have passed unnoticed. To mine it twitched with quiet significance. Someone had been imitating him, though not quite well enough. Lewis leaned over the book and frowned. "You're not going to tell me that's important, sir?" I replied only that imitation, when discovered, is usually the first betrayal in a chain. The rows of shelves extended like avenues in a cemetery, their spines faded to the same weary palette of brown and green. As we walked, I noticed a crossword abandoned upon one of the reading desks. Its clues were scattered in an untidy pencil, the last one half solved. Harmony delayed, 6 letters. The solver had written cadence, only to cross it out again. I felt a momentary stir of recognition, though I could not at once place it. Music often hides its truths in the gaps between notes. A voice interrupted my reverie. James Harker, a graduate student with eyes that betrayed too many sleepless nights, stood awkwardly before us. He claimed to have been one of Felton's protégés, though his tone suggested both reverence and resentment. Felton had guided him through the darker thickets of elegiac translation, but had also, he implied, withheld more than he bestowed. I asked if Felton had visited the library on the night he died. Harker hesitated, then confessed that he had seen him, though not alone. He could not or would not name the companion. His eyes flickered toward the far desk where Professor Redmine's distinctive scarf lay abandoned. A gesture too fleeting to be coincidence, I thought. But when I pressed him, he grew evasive, murmuring something about not wishing to slander the living. Lewis later muttered that the boy was hiding something. I agreed, though not for the same reasons. It was his phrasing that caught me, not wishing to slander the living. One speaks thus only if the dead too might be slandered. Perhaps Felton himself had worn a mask more elaborate than his reputation suggested. Before leaving, I returned to the register and allowed my fingers to linger on the page. The ink from the supposed signature had smudged faintly at the corner, as though someone unfamiliar with fountain pens had mishandled it. I rubbed the mark against my thumb, the faintest blue remaining on my skin. We stepped out into the quadrangle once more. The rain had returned, soft and persistent, tapping against the library's leaded panes. Lewis asked me what I had discovered. I told him nothing certain, only that in the realm of scholarship, truth is often a palimpsest, the original meaning scraped away and overwritten, leaving faint traces beneath. And as we crossed the court, I thought again of the crossword clue abandoned upon the desk. Harmony delayed. Not cadence, but coda perhaps. A conclusion withheld, a final note postponed. It seemed to me that Felton's life and death belonged to that same unfinished music. It was Lewis who suggested we call upon Lydia Felton. His tone carried that mixture of practicality and reluctance which comes when a man anticipates both duty and discomfort. "Widows," he muttered as we walked along a street of terraced houses that seemed to crouch against the drizzle, "are either too forthcoming or too silent." I told him I preferred the latter. Her home stood apart, not in grandeur, but in the studied restraint of its neatness. The curtains were drawn to the precise midpoint, the brass upon the knocker dulled by polish rather than neglect. When she opened the door, she offered neither welcome nor resistance, only a faint inclination of the head, as if to acknowledge a ritual she could not avoid. The sitting-room was immaculate to the point of sterility. Not a single newspaper folded on the armchair, not a cushion displaced. On the mantel stood a photograph of Felton in his academic robes, but the glass over it reflected the window so perfectly that his face seemed half erased by light. She gestured for us to sit, though she remained standing, her hands resting lightly against the back of a chair she never claimed. "My condolences," I began. She inclined her head again, nothing more. Lewis cleared his throat and asked the necessary questions. Had her husband suffered ill health? Had he spoken of feeling unwell? She replied in calm, measured tones that he had been vigorous until the end. His death, she said, was sudden, cruel, but not inexplicable. Men of his line had weak hearts. Her voice did not falter, yet something in its cadence troubled me. A line of poetry returned to my mind unbidden. Better to have loved and lost, though she rendered it differently when I prompted her. Better never to have loved at all. The substitution was subtle but striking, a misquotation, and one rehearsed with too steady a tongue. On the table near the window stood a decanter of wine, the ruby liquid catching what little light seeped through the curtains. It was corked, untouched. I remembered Felton's reputation as a man fond of the bottle. I asked if he had given it up. She allowed herself the faintest smile, a gesture so brief it might have been imagined. He drank often enough, she said, but never here. The house was hers to keep orderly, and she would not have its smell of spirits. It was then, in the pause that followed, that I noticed a small detail. The faint indentation of 2 cups upon the polished tray, though only one, remained upon it. She had removed the other before our arrival, yet the impression of its presence lingered. Someone had been received here not long before. I wondered whether she had wished us to see that, or whether it had simply betrayed her. Lewis pressed on, asking about friends or colleagues with whom Felton had quarrelled. She shook her head, her eyes resting briefly upon the photograph on the mantel, as though to remind herself of the appropriate mask. He had been admired, she said, perhaps envied, but hardly hated. Her voice was steady, but her gaze shifted when I asked whether he had confided in her about his work. She spoke of Greek elegies as though they were dusty trifles of no consequence. Yet her misquotation had already betrayed some deeper familiarity. When we rose to leave, she accompanied us to the door without fuss. As she closed it behind us, I heard the faint click of a bolt sliding into place, as though she feared intrusion from the very world that had just departed. Lewis remarked that she seemed cold. I said nothing. Coldness can be armour or indifference, and I had not yet decided which. But the detail of the cups remained with me, as did her deliberate misremembering of Tennyson. Words, like rooms, carry the shape of what has been there before. And in that silent sitting-room, something unspoken had left its trace upon both. The bursar's office at St. Sepulchre's was a place I had always disliked, not for any fault of its occupant, but for the atmosphere itself, the the faint smell of old ink and floor polish, the narrow windows begrudging the light, the ledgers piled so high they seemed to fortify the room against intrusion. Numbers can be as opaque as poetry, and often as misleading. Thomas Vale received us with a manner that tried for civility, but settled somewhere nearer irritation. His pince-nez glinted in the half-light as he gestured us toward chairs too low for comfort. He asked if we required tea. Lewis, ever polite, accepted. I declined. I had no wish to see the ritual of tepid liquid poured into cracked porcelain, accompanied by the faint clatter of a man who resented our presence. Vale began, as bursars do, with protestations of probity. The college's accounts were in perfect order, audited annually, approved by committees. Felton's death, he implied, was a matter for physicians, not accountants. Yet when I asked if Felton had drawn upon college funds for private research, his pause was almost imperceptible. He tapped his pen twice against the blotter before replying that scholars were sometimes granted discretionary allowances. Lewis, noting the evasion, asked to see the ledger. Vale hesitated, then produced it from a drawer, sliding it across the desk with a reluctance that spoke louder than any words. The pages were lined with neat figures, pounds and shillings entered in a hand both precise and joyless. Yet one entry caught my eye, a withdrawal marked "Special Research" in Felton's name, repeated several times over recent months, each sum larger than the last. I ran my finger along the columns. The ink darkened at the final entry, as though Vale had pressed harder in irritation or unease. I asked what research had required such expense. He replied that Felton was working upon a manuscript of unusual importance, though the details eluded him, or were concealed. As he spoke, I noticed a curious detail upon his desk, a half-completed crossword cut from the Telegraph, abandoned at 17 down. The clue read, "Silent agreement, 5 letters." He had written truce, yet the true answer, I knew, was not a mistake, small but revealing. Vale, the man of figures, had overlooked the simplest of solutions. It struck me that he might do the same with sums, hiding complexity where there was none. Lewis later remarked that the bursar looked positively guilty. I told him guilt and responsibility are not twins. But the missing page from Felton's diary, torn out with a precision that suggested care rather than accident, hinted that money and secrecy had embraced one another. Before leaving, I let my eyes wander once more over the ledgers. There, in the margin beside an older entry, was a faint smudge of graphite, as though an earlier annotation had been erased. I could not decipher its content, but its very erasure suggested a hand unwilling to be remembered. We stepped back into the corridor where the boards creaked with the weight of history. Lewis asked if I thought the bursar capable of murder. I told him that murder rarely announces itself in ledgers, but that concealment often does, and concealment, whether of figures or of lives, is the truest currency of such places. As we left the college, the bells of St. Mary's tolled the quarter hour, their echoes drifting across the damp air. I thought of Vale's crossword error, of truce mistaken for nod. A truce suggests hostility suspended, a nod suggests complicity acknowledged. Perhaps Felton and Vale had shared both, in ways neither would have admitted aloud. The rain had begun again, fine and persistent, darkening the stone beneath our feet. I drew my coat tighter, aware that the case was no longer a matter of a dead classicist, but of the quiet bargains made in offices where numbers served as masks. It was with some reluctance that I accepted Professor Clara Redmine's invitation to dine. I have never much cared for the semi-formal choreography of academic dinners, where intellect and ambition are passed about with the wine, each phrase rehearsed for its intended echo. Yet curiosity prevailed, as it so often does in my line of work. And perhaps, too, a flicker of something less professional, a sense that her cool elegance might afford, if not pleasure, then at least distraction. Her rooms in the north wing looked down upon the garden court. The curtains had been drawn early against the damp evening, but the scent of earth and wet stone drifted faintly through a cracked window. A gramophone played a record already familiar to me, Verdi's Requiem, its solemn Kyrie weaving through the room with uninvited grandeur. Redmine herself, tall, assured, with a manner that never quite disguised its edge, received Lewis and me with a glass of sherry pressed upon us before words had even been exchanged. We were joined by two other fellows, names less important than their presence, as spectators. The conversation flowed with the sort of fluency Oxford favours, each remark balanced precariously between wit and malice. Felton's name surfaced soon enough, as I had expected. Redmine spoke of him with a tone hovering between respect and disdain. A fine mind, yes, but always too cautious, too unwilling to publish the work that might have given him standing. She let her eyes linger upon me as she said this, as if gauging my willingness to believe. I asked when she had last seen him. The fork in her hand paused fractionally before she replied that they had dined together at high table 2 nights before his death. She spoke easily, yet I thought of Harker's glance in the library, the quick flicker toward her abandoned scarf. The pause, though momentary, was longer than it should have been. Lewis, perhaps sensing my silence, steered the talk toward the college finances. Vale's name was mentioned, with a faint smile from Redmine that suggested the bursar's punctiliousness had not won him many admirers. Money, she remarked, always finds its way into the bloodstream of a college, though no one likes to admit it. She lifted her glass as she said this, a gesture so careless it seemed deliberate. The meal itself I remember only in fragments, the faint bitterness of the wine, the unconvincing chicken pie, the brittle laughter when one of the fellows misquoted a line of Milton and Redmine corrected him with unnecessary relish. What I recall most distinctly was her insistence that Felton had once attempted to block her promotion to a senior lectureship on the grounds of insufficient publications. The bitterness in her tone was carefully cloaked, but unmistakable. At one point the gramophone needle caught in its groove, repeating a fragment of Verdi until the music itself seemed trapped. Redmine rose to correct it, and as she leaned over the machine, I noticed her hand tremble slightly. Not with age, she was younger than Felton had been, but with something closer to suppressed impatience. When at last we took our leave, Lewis remarked in the stairwell that she had spoken of Felton with scarcely a trace of grief. I told him grief can wear many costumes and some are stitched from anger. But it was not her tone alone that lingered with me. It was the fork's brief hesitation, the scarf abandoned in the library, the hand unsteady over the record player. Later that night, back in my flat, I poured myself a whiskey and sat with a crossword I had abandoned the day before. One clue read, opponent's mask, 6 letters. I wrote visor, then crossed it out. Disguise, I thought, a word that could fit more than the puzzle before me, for it seemed to me that Clara Redmine, elegant and assured, was herself a woman fluent in disguise. It was evening when James Harker found me, though found may be the wrong word, for he appeared almost to have been waiting. Loitering by the lodge as though rehearsing an encounter, he lacked the courage to begin. The rain had slackened to a fine mist, curling around the lamps and softening their glow, and the boy, he was still a boy in my eyes, seemed reluctant to step fully into the light. He asked if he might speak with me privately. Lewis, sensing the need, wandered off in search of coffee, though he would have preferred beer. I led Harker into a narrow ante-room that smelled faintly of damp wool and forgotten coal fires. He sat, but on the edge of the chair, his knees restless, his eyes darting as if afraid of some invisible auditor. He began hesitantly, saying that Dr. Felton had been his mentor, his only true guide through the morass of elegiac verse. Felton, he claimed, had entrusted him with the outline of a manuscript, something that would, in his words, change everything. At first he described it as a gift freely offered, a token of confidence. Yet moments later he contradicted himself, insisting that he had discovered it by accident, half hidden among the fellow's notes. His account wavered like a flame in draught. I asked if he still possessed any portion of it. He shook his head with too much emphasis, as though to convince himself. Only fragments read, never kept. He seemed almost relieved to admit this, though I suspected relief of another kind, the kind one feels when confessing only half the truth. What struck me most was not the inconsistency of his story. Students are prone to such embellishments, but the peculiar phrasing he used. He said he had feared being accused of theft, not that he had feared stealing. There is a difference. One betrays anxiety about perception, the other about conscience. His hands trembled as he spoke, yet his eyes betrayed a faint brightness, almost a liberation. It occurred to me that he might not have mourned Felton's death as deeply as convention required. Lewis, when I mentioned this later, observed that the boy seemed positively unburdened. I could not disagree. There was another detail, small but insistent. On the cuff of Harker's shirt, barely visible in the poor light, I noticed a faint smear of ink, blue-black, the sort that stains only when a fountain pen has been mishandled. It was the same shade I had rubbed from the library register a few days earlier. Coincidence, perhaps, but coincidences in Oxford often mask the more deliberate crossings of lives. I let him speak on, offering only the occasional prompt. He told me Felton had hinted at enemies, colleagues who resented him, even feared what he might publish. Yet when pressed, Harker named no one. He would only murmur that knowledge can be more dangerous than ignorance, that scholarship is never free from rivalry. At one point he lowered his voice and asked if I thought Felton might have been killed for what he knew. It was not the question itself that unsettled me, but the peculiar eagerness with which it was asked, as though he needed me to confirm his own suspicion, or perhaps his own guilt. I thought then of a crossword clue I had puzzled over the night before. Confession's partner, 7 letters. I had scribbled atonement, then crossed it out. The truer answer, I realized now, was silence. For most confessions end not in clarity, but in the silence of what remains unsaid. When at last he rose to leave, he seemed lighter, almost buoyant, as though unburdened by the half-truths he had shared. I watched him cross the court, his figure dissolving into the mist, and wondered whether he had spoken from fear or from the peculiar intoxication of having been close to a man whose death now lent him significance. Lewis returned with his coffee and asked what the boy had wanted. Only to clear his conscience, I said. Though whose conscience it was we had cleared, his or mine, I could not tell. There is a peculiar satisfaction in constructing a theory, even one that later collapses under its own weight. For a time, it grants the illusion of order, the comfort that the scattered pieces might at last align. And so it was with my first attempt at explaining Felton's death. The bursar, Thomas Vale, seemed to me the most likely culprit. His ledgers carried their own faint odour of deceit. His manner, that brittle defensiveness of a man accustomed to small concealments. Money, I reasoned, had passed through Felton's hands too freely, and the missing page from the diary suggested an appointment worth erasing. If the bursar had feared exposure, what easier means than a draft slipped into the classicist's nightly glass? Digitalis, perhaps, its bitterness masked by wine. It all fitted or seemed to. I shared the outline with Lewis as we sat in the gloom of the college bar. He listened with his customary patience, his hands clasped around a pint of bitter. "It makes sense, sir," he said, "but not too much sense." He had a point. Explanations that fall together too neatly rarely survive the morning. That night, in my flat, I sat with the crossword abandoned on my desk. One clue read, "Poison's effect, 9 letters." I wrote paralysis, then hesitated. The truer answer, revealed the following day, was stillness. How often I had mistaken one for the other. The post-mortem report arrived the next morning, delivered in its sealed envelope, the pages still faintly creased, from the pathologist's impatient hands. Felton had died of digitalis, yes, but not ingested in wine or whiskey. The traces were consistent with a dose administered directly as medicine. Vale, with all his fuss over figures, would have had no such access. I sat in the college quad, the paper heavy in my pocket, and felt that particular weariness which follows a theory undone. The rain had eased, but the stones beneath my feet were slick with its memory. Lewis found me there and asked whether the bursar was finished. "He's finished," I told him, though not in the way I had hoped. He asked what I meant, and I replied only that numbers, however crooked, do not kill. Still a doubt lingered. I remembered the crossword in Vale's office, the clue he had missolved. Silent agreement, 5 letters. He had written truce. The right answer had been nod. It struck me then that my own solution to Felton's death had been a kind of truce with reason, a fragile armistice between fact and supposition. What I needed was the nod, the subtle acknowledgement of something overlooked, something almost imperceptible. That evening I poured myself a whiskey and let the city's silence press in upon me. From my window the lights of Oxford glowed faintly, blurred by mist, each lamp a halo unto itself. I thought of Lydia Felton, her misquotation of Tennyson, her careful removal of a cup from the tray. I thought of Redmine, her hand trembling as she corrected the gramophone, her bitterness masked by poise. And I thought of young Harker with ink-stained cuffs and the eagerness of one who longs to confess, but not completely. The bursar, for all his evasions, seemed suddenly peripheral, a figure useful to suspicion, but not to truth. My theory had provided comfort, nothing more. And yet I could not bring myself to discard it entirely. For in these cases the false solutions are not wasted. They leave their residue, like the faint blue smear of ink that clings to the thumb long after the page has been turned. I closed the crossword, unfinished, and poured another measure. Stillness, the clue had demanded, and stillness was what Felton had found, though not, I was now certain, at the bursar's hand. I spent that morning alone in Felton's rooms, though alone is never quite the word for it. A dead man leaves traces of himself behind, faint but insistent, and I felt them everywhere, in the smoke-stained curtains, in the indentation upon the cushion of his armchair, in the thin residue of ink upon the blotter. Lewis had gone to speak with the porter, leaving me with the quiet which is where I work best, or perhaps only where I pretend to. On the desk lay several volumes of Greek elegy, their pages furred with dust save for one, which had been thumbed more recently. I turned its leaves with slow care, reading the marginalia. Felton's hand was distinctive, precise, the letters formed with the impatience of one accustomed to being obeyed. Yet one note jarred. He had translated a line from Propertius with a gloss that made no sense. Lacrimae written as laughter, an error certainly, but too deliberate, too impossible to be chance. Felton had been a pedant. He would sooner have torn out the page than mistranslated. It was not the first time the word had been altered. I traced 3 other instances, each substitution slight, but each carrying a pattern of inversion: grief displaced by gaiety, sorrow replaced by something less heavy, as though someone had wanted to mask the true tone of the poem. I leaned back, listening to the rain against the window. Lydia Felton's voice returned to me then, her faintly rehearsed misquotation of Tennyson. Better never to have loved at all. She had inverted meaning too, not from ignorance, but from design. Words misremembered, words repurposed. Someone had been feeding her a script. Lewis returned with news trivial in itself. The porter recalled Felton had received a visitor the week of his death, a woman cloaked against the rain, her identity unasked, her presence unrecorded. He wondered aloud whether it had been the widow. I doubted it. Lydia had seemed too precise in her mourning to risk the irregularity of such visits. I asked him if the porter had noticed her gait, her speech. He shook his head, though he admitted she moved quickly, impatiently. I thought then of Redmine, her fork hesitating in the air, her hand trembling as she lifted the gramophone needle. She was a woman too careful to let her words stumble, and yet, like Felton's mistranslations, her movements betrayed the smallest falter. Later in my flat I took up the crossword once more. The clue that held me was deceptively simple. Opposite of truth, 4 letters. The solver had written myth. I wrote lie, then paused. A lie can be deliberate, but a myth is constructed over time, shaped by repetition, clothed in the garments of half-belief. Felton's mistranslations, Lydia's rehearsed misquote, neither had the sharp edge of a lie, but both had the softer, more dangerous persistence of myth. That evening I walked the college cloisters alone, the rain dripping from the eaves, the stone beneath my shoes slick as polished marble. The chapel door stood ajar once more, the carved inscription waiting in its stubborn misspelling. Sepulchre instead of sepulchre. The error had been repeated too often to be accidental, and in its persistence I began to see the outline of something else, the deliberate reshaping of memory. Lewis asked me, as we parted, if I thought we were close. I told him closeness is an illusion, like distance. One walks in circles until a single word tilts everything. But I felt, for the first time, that the circle was tightening. Back in my rooms I poured a measure of whiskey and watched the amber dissolve against the glass. Felton had mistranslated grief as laughter. Lydia had twisted love into denial. Both deceptions pointed to a single hand, a mind fluent in disguise, a scholar who knew how to turn words against themselves. I left the whiskey unfinished. Outside, the city exhaled its wet breath against the window. Somewhere in the silence, a poem waited, not misread, but deliberately rewritten. And it was there I knew that I would find the beginning of the end. I had returned to the library that morning, with no clear plan, only the dull conviction that somewhere in Felton's papers lay the line I had been waiting for. The rain had ceased, leaving the pavement slick as mirrors, and the air inside the college was heavy with the musk of damp coats hung out in corridors. Silence reigned, but not the restful silence of prayer or sleep. This was the silence of a building that had witnessed too much and learned not to speak. It was on the upper shelf of the Milton section that my hand came across it. A diary page, folded once, slipped inside Paradise Lost like a reluctant bookmark. The handwriting was Felton's, no doubt of that, and the words, though hastily written, carried the precision of a man accustomed to exactness. He had recorded an appointment with Clara Redmine, noting a time and place in a manner that betrayed urgency. There was a sentence added, barely legible, suggesting he meant to confront her with something that could not remain hidden. A plagiarism, I thought, a theft of words as grievous to a scholar as coin stolen from the bursar's chest. I read the page twice, then a third time, until the ink seemed to blur into itself. Why here, hidden in Milton? Felton had been deliberate in his choices. He would not have left such a fragment to chance. Milton, whose blindness demanded dictation, whose words others had to transcribe, a poet reliant on the fidelity of those around him. The echo was too clear to ignore. When I sought Redmine later, she received me in her rooms, with that calm hauteur she cultivated so well. Her desk was ordered, the curtains half drawn against the pallid light. She regarded me with curiosity rather than fear. I asked about Felton. She did not deny their meeting. She spoke of it with the faintest amusement, as though recalling the posturing of a man beneath her intellect. He had threatened to expose her, she said, over an article she had written years ago, one in which certain lines had borne too striking a resemblance to an earlier translation. She dismissed it as coincidence, but the tremor in her voice betrayed a deeper chord. I let the silence grow, the kind that demands filling. She poured herself wine, though her hand was unsteady, and admitted that she had tired of Felton's sanctimony. He was a man of minor talent, she said, who would rather destroy another's work than risk the mediocrity of his own. She did not speak of poison, nor of digitalis, but the possibility hovered between us like the faint residue of a candle flame. Lewis, when I told him, asked whether she had confessed. I shook my head. Confessions are for the guilty who wish to be absolved. Redmine was of another breed. She saw her actions as necessary, even just. If Felton had to be silenced, it was to preserve something larger, her own place in the annals of scholarship. Later, I sat alone in the quad, the diary page folded once more in my pocket. The bells tolled, indifferent as ever, while students hurried past in gowns too thin for the weather. I thought of Felton's mistranslations, of grief altered to laughter, of Lydia's rehearsed misquote, of Harker's ink-stained cuffs. Each had been a fragment of disguise. Yet it was Redmine who had mastered the art, a scholar who knew that words could be rewritten, meanings inverted, truths buried beneath gloss. That night in my flat I turned to the crossword again. The clue that arrested me read Death's Companion, 5 letters. I wrote Muse, then erased it. Later I tried Shade. Both fitted, neither satisfied. In the end the true answer revealed itself only as silence deepened. Elegy, the word that had haunted this case from the first. An elegy not only for Felton, but for the illusion that scholarship and ambition might ever live at peace. I drained my glass and stared at the blank squares left unsolved. Some puzzles, I thought, should remain unfinished. After Redmine's arrest, the college seemed to fold in on itself, as though determined to erase the scandal with silence. Oxford is practised in such arts. The lawns were trimmed, the notices pinned to boards, the bells tolled with their usual indifference. Yet beneath it all there lingered a faint disturbance, the echo of footsteps in corridors after midnight, the weight of whispers that never reached full speech. I returned to St. Sepulchre's a week later, not from duty but from habit. The porter gave me a nod that carried both recognition and fatigue. He had polished the brass upon the lodge door to a gleam that struck me as almost penitential. I walked across the court, the damp stone releasing its odour of moss and soot, and entered the library once more. The books unmoved continued their silent vigil. Felton's desk had been cleared, the manuscripts boxed, his marginalia destined for some archive where scholars yet unborn might puzzle over his corrections. Yet the chair still bore the indentation of his absence, and I felt the peculiar ache that comes when presence is defined only by what it leaves behind. Lewis joined me in the quad afterwards. He asked whether justice had been done. I gave him no answer. Justice is a word too neat for such matters. Redmine had admitted enough in her own oblique fashion to justify the handcuffs, yet I could not shake the suspicion that her guilt was more complicated than poison and self-preservation. Pride, certainly. Ambition, certainly. But there had been something in her voice when she spoke of Felton's mediocrity, a tone not of contempt alone, but of disappointment, as if she had once expected more of him. Lydia Felton had retreated from Oxford altogether to her sister's house in Sussex. She sent no letter of thanks, no protest, no explanation. I pictured her in a sitting-room as neat and barren as the one I had visited, her life folded away like unused linen. The photograph on the mantel perhaps discarded, perhaps not. Women like Lydia do not weep where others can see. Harker, too, slipped quietly from the TED stage. I heard that he had applied for a post in Durham, though whether from shame, ambition, or mere chance I could not tell. His confession had been half-formed, his truths partial, and in the end he seemed relieved that events had overtaken him. Perhaps he had loved Felton in that oblique way students sometimes do, but if so, it was a love already soured by rivalry and need. The bursar, Vale, returned to his ledgers. I imagined him hunched over figures late at night, pausing only to puzzle through another crossword. He would continue to missolve clues, truce for nod, myth for lie, but his sums would balance in the end. Such men rarely fall, though they teeter always on the edge of something less than honour. And so the college moved on. The dons argued in committees, the students scribbled essays at dawn, the choir rehearsed motets in the chapel, where the misspelt inscription endured, stubborn as ever. A single letter, wrong by design or mistake, yet left untouched for centuries. Oxford has never been swift to correct itself. I remember walking back across Magdalen Bridge that evening. The rain had cleared, leaving the river sluggish, its surface broken only by the oars of a solitary boat. I paused, leaning on the stone, listening to the faint scrape of water against wood. Lewis asked me then, "Do you think she regretted it?" I told him regret is the most unreliable of emotions. It can look like pride, or like sorrow, or like nothing at all. Back in my flat, I unfolded a crossword from that day's paper. One clue stared at me. Justice and certain 7 letters. I wrote balance, then erased it. Later I tried verdict, neither satisfied. Perhaps the right answer had been silence all along. The whiskey on my table remained half full. I let it sit, the amber darkening as the night thickened. Outside, Oxford prepared itself for another morning of lectures and essays, as though Felton had never lived, as though Redmine had never faltered. And I, left with the crossword unsolved, wondered whether the truth had been uncovered, or only rearranged into something bearable. I walked alone across Magdalen Bridge that evening, the rain having withdrawn to a sullen mist that clung to the lamps and blurred their light into halos. The stones beneath my shoes were slick, carrying the faint smell of riverweed and damp leaves. Oxford lay behind me in its usual hush. The colleges crouched against the night as though unwilling to admit how easily one of their own had slipped into the silence of death. Redmine's confession, or what passed for one, had settled the matter in the eyes of the law. Lewis had said as much with the blunt certainty of a man who trusted verdicts and handcuffs more than shadows and words. I had nodded, not wishing to disturb his faith, though within myself I felt none of the resolution he sought. Cases end, yes, but not always where they should. The river carried reflections of the city with a sluggish patience, scattering them in ripples as though the past itself resisted clarity. I paused, leaning on the parapet, watching a solitary cigarette butt drift downstream until it vanished beneath the arch. I thought of Felton's mistranslations, of grief rewritten as laughter, of Lydia's deliberate misquote, of Harker's evasions. Words bent out of shape, meanings turned inside out, until truth became another puzzle half solved. At home, the crossword waited, folded on my desk beside the glass of whiskey I had left untouched the night before. The clue that stared at me was stark. End of life, unfinished, 7 letters. I had written demise, then abandoned it. Later I tried passing, neither satisfied. I wondered if the answer was line itself, or elegy, or perhaps no answer at all. Some endings resist even the courtesy of definition. The case returned to me in fragments as I stared at the blank squares. Lydia's house with its barren tidiness, the 2 cups upon the tray. Vale hunched behind his ledgers, missing the simplest of clues. Harker's ink-stained cuff betraying his hand in the library. And Redmine, elegant, proud, trembling as she lifted the gramophone needle. Each detail belonged to a pattern, yet the pattern itself seemed reluctant to close. I thought then of music. How often Schubert had intruded upon my mind during this case, his symphony left unfinished, its movements circling but never concluding. Perhaps that was the true shape of things, an elegy without resolution, a line left hanging in the air, waiting for a note that would never be written. Lewis had asked me, as we parted outside the college, if I believed we had uncovered the truth. I told him truth is an untidy business, like rain on stone. It soaks where it will, leaving stains that no amount of scrubbing can erase. He had frowned, perhaps wondering why I could not simply declare the matter closed. But closure is for the innocent, not for those who spend their days among the dead. The whiskey glowed amber in the half-light. I drank slowly, feeling its warmth spread, not as comfort, but as reminder. Life, like the crossword, offers clues that are never fully solved, mistakes that linger on the page long after the ink has dried. Felton was gone, Redmine condemned, yet the elegy remained unfinished. Outside, the bells began their measured toll, indifferent as ever. I listened until the last chime dissolved into the night. Then I folded the crossword, unsolved, and set it aside. Some puzzles, I thought, are meant to stay incomplete. And so I sat there, the city breathing beyond the window, the rain returning in soft intervals, and I allowed the silence to stretch across the room. A cigarette half smoked on the ashtray, a glass half drained on the desk, a line half written in the mind. Oxford, eternal in its stone and shadow, kept its secret still.